University of Maryland Global Campus has more than 20 years' experience providing affordable online education to military service members and working adults. Offering low tuition, no-cost digital resources replacing most textbooks, scholarships for those who qualify, and more. Learn more at umgc.edu/podcast.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. This is Elmo Odor Jr. Thank you so much, brother Nazam. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Elmo. Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's my pleasure to meet you and to appear on your podcast. My name's Nazam. I have a YouTube channel by the name of Nazam44. And I really started it back when YouTube came because I was collecting lots of religious discussions between Muslims and Christians, namely the works of Sheikh Ahmed Deedat, may God bless him, and also Dr. Shabir Ali. And I had lots of these kind of VHS cassettes and stuff, and I wanted to spread and share their message and their knowledge with others, because I felt that in the same way I benefited from them, others can also benefit from them. And YouTube really gave me a platform of uploading these lectures and debates and dialogues which they had with people of other faiths, namely Christians. It really provided me a way of reaching out and sharing this with the world. And from there, people got to know me, and I have a Facebook page, and I'm also quite active on Twitter as well. And I've been going to Speaker's Corner. I don't know if anyone's heard of Speaker's Corner in the Philippines. But in the last 3 years or so, it's become very popular, Speaker's Corner, especially since people are now recording the discussions and debates and uploading them onto YouTube. So every week they get thousands upon thousands of hits. And so people see me in the background walking around. Normally I do try to have discussions, but normally my discussions are not recorded on camera. And also I prefer the more kind of organic discussions, that's rather than, I feel more natural, whereas on the camera it tends to change the dynamics of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, you seem to be someone who is more on I would call someone who likes to debate or argumentative in a way, but in a good way. It seems that there are those personalities.
Well, I actually, I used to actually be into the whole debate discussion, but due to like my past experience, I found that normally they don't end on a positive or friendly way, and usually they can become quite spiteful and polemical. And my original intention is try to bring people closer to Islam rather than drive them further away. And I don't find that sometimes debates always do that. Although I'm not against debates, I do feel that they also have their place. And no doubt, like Islam has a unique voice in the world, which is different from what other people are calling towards. So there is a time and place for debates, but arguments, I admit, I'm not a very controversial or someone who likes to argue with people. I prefer to find common grounds and build bridges.
Okay, cool. And it seems to me that there are a lot of these kind of debates and arguments, discussions, especially on YouTube. And when you talk about Speaker's Corner, I'm reminded of people like in the Christian side, like Christian Prince or Sam Shamoon. People, for me, being a Christian, I don't like this kind of debate. I don't or the way they do their methods. Like for example, they argue with a Muslim, and then when there's a disagreement happening, they would call someone a mule or a mutta, and to me that's very unchristianly. And I don't think that someone who is a Christian should claim to be that way, if they behave in that way. What do you think?
Precisely, yes. There's actually passages that even in the Bible that speaks against this type of behavior. So, for example, I think it's in one of the letters of Peter, in First Peter chapter 3. It says to the effect that if someone belittles you or mocks you or makes fun out of you, then you should respond in a way in which humbles that person, but through your good conduct and moral behavior. But I agree that some of these preachers, whether either on the Muslim side or on the Christian side, they don't necessarily represent their own teachings fairly or accurately, and are not good role models. Especially if you think of that the world is now becoming more and more secular, especially in the West, and you have many atheists and agnostics or just non-religious people, and they look at these types of debates and they just wonder, like, why are these people behaving in this type of fashion? The purpose of religion is supposed to make you a better human being, better in conduct. But when they see these types of things, it just kind of proves what they think that they knew all along, which is that religion is some kind of harmful force in the world, which they feel they need to fight against. But I guess even atheists has their own kind of bad fruits as well. And one of the things that turns people off religion, from my experience, is hypocrisy or religious hypocrisy, that people see, people acting in a way which is contrary to their own religious teachings. And they just find this totally, ugly and just, why should they follow that particular path if the people that claim to belong to it and represent it are not even following it themselves?
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me though that your specialty is more on as you said, comparative religion. And so what specific arguments do you have against let's say Christianity?
I wouldn't so much say that there are arguments against Christianity, but I found that by myself looking into comparative religion and studying the Islamic faith as well as the faith of Christians has helped me to understand my own faith better and appreciate it more. And I don't see Islam as coming to take away belief in the God of Christians or in the faith of Jesus, because the Quran says that our God and your God, when addressing the Christian community, is one. And both communities believe in the unseen creator of the world, and the philosophical and rational arguments that we use all point to the same unseen creator of of the universe. Where we tend to differ is over the nature and divinity of God, as well as whether Jesus shares in that nature or divinity of God, or whether he was solely a servant, a messenger.
Okay, so it's more on specifically the incarnation of Christ as the Son of God. That's where you find problems in the in the Christian model of an understanding of who God is, specifically the Trinity as well.
Yes. I mean, as you know, we have biographies of many great leaders in the world, and the primary sources for the life of Jesus are the New Testament Gospels. I mean, there are other Gospels besides these four, but generally these four are recognized as being the most authoritative and most accurate when it comes to studying the life of Jesus. And as the four, as many of our listeners will probably already know, is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What is interesting is that scholars from over 1,000 years already noticed that there's a sharp divide among three of these Gospels, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the fourth Gospel, the Gospel according to John, is seen as a very radically different Gospel from the first three. And as you know, the Gospels were not written by one person who sat down and wrote the whole thing all at once, but the four Gospels are from four different writers, and they give us a kind of snapshot or window as to what Christians believed at the time when these four Gospels were written. And what is interesting to note is that in the earliest Gospels, especially the Gospel according to Mark, which is our shortest and earliest of the four Gospels to be written, it presents a very human Jesus, a Jesus that resembles closely the Islamic faith, like a Jesus that does mighty works and miracles, and is referred to as a prophet in Mark chapter 6, verse 4, and also referred to as the Son of Mary. And these are titles that are mentioned about Jesus in the Holy Quran as well. But when we go to the Gospel according to John, there we find many of those titles which Christians believe in about Jesus are commonly found in the fourth Gospel, such as Son of God, the title Lord as well. And also the way and manner in which Jesus is presented in the fourth Gospel shows him to be somewhat divine, because Jesus appears to be omniscient, meaning that he appears to know everything, or he knows even beforehand what the person is thinking and what the person is going to ask. Whereas on the other hand, in the Gospel according to Mark, Jesus is shown on a number of occasions to be limited in his knowledge and not know something. So he would ask a certain question and it's expecting or seeking an answer from it. So for example, in one of the healing stories in Mark's Gospel, a woman who had hemorrhage, she had heard about Jesus and she had heard that he has many mighty powers. And so she comes up from behind him and touches him from his cloak. And it says in Mark that Jesus felt the power coming out of him, but he didn't know in which direction that it went. And so Jesus turned and looked to see who it was. And still he didn't know. And so he asked his disciples, "Who touched me?" And the disciples, answer and say that you see the crowd all gathering around you, pushing you and shoving you. What do you mean, who touched you? And so Jesus, not being satisfied, still kept on looking to see who it was until eventually the woman comes forward and says it was her. And Jesus says, "Woman, it is your faith that healed you." So now, by contrast, here you have a Jesus with a lot of healing power, but at the same time, Jesus is not in full control of that power, in that there had to be some higher power in order to direct that power towards the woman for her to be healed. But by contrast, in John's Gospel, there's a number of episodes in which Jesus always seems to know beforehand and appears to be omniscient and all knowledgeable. But you can even compare, Mark's gospel and John's gospel on one hand, and because these are the first and the last, you can see the differences are more striking. But even if you compare the gospels that were written in between Mark and John, which will be Matthew and Luke, you can notice some subtle differences as well. So this story about the woman being healed, it's reported in Matthew's gospel. It's remembered in Matthew, but with some slight differences, and the differences are significant in that in Matthew's version of the same story, the same woman comes from Jesus from behind and touches his cloak and gets healed, but the difference being is that Jesus doesn't turn around to see who has done it, nor does he ask his disciples who touch him. But in Matthew, Jesus he already knows who it was, like he already knows who touches him, and so he simply turns and looks at the woman and says, "Woman, it is your faith that has healed you." So in Matthew's gospel, even though the story is very brief, but nonetheless, here you have a Jesus who appears to be omniscient, and that he just simply turns and looks at the woman and already says, "Woman, it is your faith that healed you."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in a way, you're one of the reasons why you seem that the biblical accounts of Jesus' life have some subtle contradictions, and in a way, it's not really something that you can rely on. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's not something that we cannot rely on, because I feel that if we were to discard the Gospels completely and even the New Testament, that would just be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What I try to study is like to look at the four accounts and to look at the acts and deeds of Jesus, and to see if these sayings are multiply attested, for example, in more than one source, as well as other historical criteria that would establish an authentic saying or deed. So I'm not saying that this story about the woman being healed is not authentic or not true. There probably was, or possibly, some kind of event in the life of Jesus in which something like this happened, in which the woman was healed. But the way it's been passed down and the way it's been remembered is in a way in which you can see that the portrait of Jesus is being shaped, and he's being almost mutated and becoming into the God that Christians would eventually believe in, and the second person of the Holy Trinity. So I feel that the Islamic faith is really a call to believe in that Jesus that was there even before the Gospel according to Mark was written, because even Mark must have had predecessors or people that remembered Jesus and told stories about him even before his Gospel was written. But since we don't have like an antecedent to Mark's Gospel, we cannot make that same comparison like we can with Mark and the other Gospels, to see where Mark may have changed his story specifically in order to maybe make Jesus appear more divine or more godly than what he actually was.
Mm-hmm. Then it seems to me that when you, for example, present these arguments, is that the early Christians sort of, as you said, they mutated their view on Jesus, and this ultimately formed into him being having the doctrine of his divinity, and then him being part of the Holy Trinity, and continually evolving into the Christianity we have today. Is that what you're saying? But originally, Jesus was just a prophet, but they turned him into this Son of God that people
precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. That's the conclusion of the argument. But we can look at like specific examples, and we can see how, Jesus mutates, from one gospel to another, and his status is risen. So it's almost like Jesus is being photoshopped amongst the gospels. So you have the Gospel of Mark, in which he's photoshopped, but then Matthew and Luke Photoshop him even more, and then John, Photoshops him the most.
I see. Okay. Then in terms of, I guess, the reliability of the text, this is the challenge you present, is that in terms of how the witnesses portray Jesus, this sort of part of being a secondary source is where the unreliability comes in, because those witnesses that, or the sources might have actually portrayed Jesus differently, or as you say, photoshopped him, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And there could be like many reasons for this, but also I should also add a caveat that when we speak of like trends, we do so like in the sense of like we look at the overall trend. So like when we say that the house prices are rising, when we look at the chart, it's not necessarily a straight line going upwards, but there might be zigzags in between. But overall, we see that the line is going towards upwards. And similarly, like you can see, like when it comes to the divinity of Jesus and the status of Jesus becoming more and more great, there may be like zigzags or some exceptional examples in between, but generally the overall trend is to make Jesus appear bigger and greater than what he actually was or would ever accept. So on the one hand, you have like gospel writers magnifying like the acts of Jesus, or even like some of the sayings of Jesus as well, when they were repeated by word of mouth and also written down and then copied and then passed down. Even the sayings themselves also change. So for example, in Mark chapter 10, I believe it's verse 17, a young man comes up to Jesus and calls him good teacher, and Jesus answers, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." So this appears that Jesus, is rebuking the man for calling him good. He would rather prefer if the man just addressed him as teacher, because only God is good. And at face value, this is what the story seems to be teaching. But when you go to Matthew's gospel, the next gospel, because the gospels as they appear in the New Testament, they're not necessarily in the chronological order, but they're in the order in which they're placed by the church, but not necessarily in the chronological order. So chronologically, Mark is first, and then say Matthew is after Mark. And in Matthew, he repeats the same story in Mark's gospel, but in Matthew chapter 19, verse 17 and forward, the same man comes up to Jesus on the same occasion and says, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus answers, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" And that's in the same reported sentence. So in Mark, Jesus answers, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." But in Matthew, in the same underlined sentence, Jesus says, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" So Matthew appears has like radically, changed the saying in order to deflect that Jesus was denying that he's good. But in changing the saying, he's also created another problem in that, Jesus as the Messiah of God, he should welcome a question about salvation. He shouldn't rebuke the man for asking him what is good, but he should, the man asking what good thing must he do to be saved. But Jesus appears to answer saying, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" But he shouldn't really say that, because he's the Messiah, and so he should welcome questions about salvation or what good deed. So the way that Matthew has reworded and changed the story has just created another problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I guess though
yeah.
I see a problem in your methodology in terms that in a way these for example these narratives or in presented in Jesus's life, they might actually have a purpose or meaning in the grand scheme of how Christianity perceives it. For example, in that same story you presented about a man asking Jesus about how he what good he must do to be saved. It might be that Christian apologist could explain that it was not yet Jesus's time to tell others about what he has to do. So especially in how secretive he was on, for example, on his crucifixion and all the events to be happen, especially with his apostles.
Yeah. I mean, a Christian may have a response, and I'm sure that there are responses, but we have to also sometimes ask ourselves that just because someone has a response to everything, does that response make sense? Here Jesus already now has begun his ministry. And so he wants to have followers, and naturally here you have a man who sees Jesus and becomes interested about what Jesus is teaching, and so now wants to know, according to Jesus' message, what must he do to be saved? So it makes no sense for Jesus to rebuke the man and say, why do you ask me about what he's
I agree
good?
with you. It actually doesn't make sense if he were to be simply a prophet, I guess. But if he had some greater purpose as to why he was on earth, his primary motivation wouldn't be to gather more followers, but it was to fulfill this purpose. But I guess, as you're right, that there will probably be responses, and just because there is a response doesn't mean it's right. But I wanna drive this into what method specific and consistent.
Sorry, just quickly wrap, not to belabor the point. The only reason why we're discussing this is because it's in Matthew's Gospel, but we're really debating about something which probably Jesus never said. And the only reason why we know that Jesus probably never said it is because we can compare Matthew's Gospel with Mark. Mark being the early account, we see Mark seems to have the original version of the story, which Matthew has modified. If we didn't have Mark's Gospel, then we wouldn't have known that this story has been changed. And the only reason why Mark's account is problematic is that if you believe that Jesus is God, then it's an odd thing for Jesus to say, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. So Matthew, I'm not saying Matthew also believed that Jesus was God, but Matthew, in revising the account, had just created a new problem by trying to solve one problem by creating a new problem.
And my question was that if we could drive this conversation to knowing what specific and consistent methodology you use in order to assess and analyze the Gospels for what it truly means. Maybe present what your hermeneutics is, or what is your way to understand the meta a meta understanding of what the Gospel presents.
I tend to look at the social historical context. I look at the place and time in which they were written, and to whom were they written, and what did the author intended his writer to his audience to understand. And it's more easy to do that with the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, because in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke you can apply what is known as redactional criticism. So when you compare, because basically nowadays, like every New Testament scholar now believes that virtually all New Testament scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel as a source for writing their own gospel. So that means that when Matthew sat down and wrote his own gospel, he would have had a copy of Mark's gospel in front of him. And so he could just simply copy down what Mark wrote in front of him. But as he's going, he also has the chance to rework Mark, as well as to change it, as well as to make omissions, additions to Mark's text. And so when Matthew does that, that tells us something about his motivations as to why Matthew would do something like this. So in the two examples I gave of the woman, for example, being healed by Jesus, and the question that Jesus asked, why do you, who was it that touched me? As well as when Jesus says, why do you call me good? In these two stories, Jesus appears to be, very much human, but also a prophet of God. And so maybe this didn't gel too well with Matthew. And so Matthew wanted to just kind of promote Jesus a bit more than a prophet by just removing anything that might show Jesus to be limited.
Okay. Well, you said earlier that you take a look at the social cultural situation or circumstance of the where and why or what and who wrote this gospel. But it seems to me though that, for example, you take for some parts of the story as evidence that look, Jesus is just a normal human, he's just a prophet. But then this part of the story has been twisted by the writer to Photoshop Jesus Christ. But the thing is that in order for you to be able to identify which ones are reliable and which parts of the story is actually a I would say different or wrong or not exactly what happened.
Revised.
You're revised. Yes. Is how do you define which ones and what is your methodology on that as well?
It's just more so like a detailed comparative study of the four Gospels, and by contrasting them with one to another. So just as Matthew and Luke had sources, Mark must have also had some written source before him. And today, some scholars would advocate a kind of proto-Mark, which is like an early Passion account, which lacked any details about Jesus' resurrection, but only that Jesus was crucified and then placed inside some airy tomb. And then from there, his body was discovered to be missing. So this would be like even earlier or some kind of early source of Mark's gospel, which Mark, the author, takes over and then adds the resurrection, like the passion predictions, as well as in Mark chapter 16, verse 8, about the promise that Jesus would appear to Peter as well as to the disciples in Galilee. So it requires like a lot of work. I mean, I'm not a scholar myself, but I've read and listened to scholars. Actually, many years ago, I actually pursued biblical studies at college as well. So I did a couple of modules on the New Testament as well as on Jesus and Paul. And I also did on the book of Ecclesiastes as well.
Well, now that you mentioned Paul, the epistles and the revelations, are also Romans, are in Acts, I think. Acts, yeah. These are also a huge, I think, part of how Jesus is seen as the part, one of the persons of the Holy Trinity. So in a sense, I've talked about I talked to a lot of my Muslim friends, and they say that they see how Paul actually is they do not recognize his authority, I guess, in his, especially in how he writes or what he has written. They would recognize Jesus' apostles and Jesus himself, But in terms of who Paul is, that's where they draw the line and say that Paul is not someone we recognize as a prophet. What would you say?
Yeah, I would say that this isn't like just a Muslim polemic against Christians, but this polemic that Paul isn't an apostle of Jesus is actually found within the pages of the New Testament itself, because Paul himself indicates that there were other preachers that didn't accept Paul as an apostle or undermined his apostolic authority. And this comes out especially clear in his letter to the Galatians. If you read the first 2 chapters of Galatians and you study that with any, with a biblical commentary, you see that Paul, unlike his other letters, he begins like with, praises and peace and salutations from God the Father, and then he thanks God for the Christian church that he's founded and for their continuous faith. But Galatians, after Paul greets the Galatians, instead of thanking God, for the faith that the Galatians have, he instead goes into a criticism and he blasts them for, turning away from the gospel that he had left them with to another gospel, which he says isn't really a gospel. And lay people, when they read this, they tend to assume that this other gospel may have been some Jewish opponents, but if you read it very carefully, these were actually other Christians who had a gospel, but a different understanding to what Paul preached. Paul would go into like a certain town and he would preach his understanding of Christianity, and then subsequently to him, some other teachers would come and teach these people the very opposite to what Paul taught them, turning them away from the teachings of Paul to another gospel. And then Paul would then write back to them, criticizing them as to why they, turned away from the gospel that he had already left them with to another gospel. And the manner in which Paul speaks about these other teachers, it appears that these were like very important, significant figures, because he refers to them as super apostles in his other letter in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5, I believe. And so who were these super apostles? So people tend to think that these super apostles would have been important figures or pillars of the church. They would have been people like Peter, James, and John. And these were like the earliest, companions or followers of Jesus. So these would have been people like what Muslims know from the Prophet Muhammad as people like the Caliph Abu Bakr or Umar or Usman or Ali. So during the lifetime of the what we call the Sahaba, if you wanted to learn about Islam, what the Prophet Muhammad taught, then you would go to like his companions, especially his major companions or his close disciples. So I'm sure you've heard of Abu Bakr. Yeah. So Jesus as well had disciples and followers, but among his followers, he had inner disciples known as the 12. And even among the 12, he seemed to have like 3 major disciples: Peter, James, and John. So these were the people back during the lifetime of of Jesus and the disciples you would have gone to learn about Christianity. And Paul, in his letter to the Galatians in chapter 2, I believe it's verse 11, or it's around there, disparagingly seems to refer to them as like those who are regarded or seen with high esteem. What this means is that he doesn't necessarily see them or regard them as being, as pillars or important people, but this is how other people regard or see them as. But he goes on to say what they are makes no difference to him, because God shows no favoritism. But regardless, these were people who had actually spent time with Jesus and met Jesus while Jesus walked the earth. And so Paul was a new man. He obviously never met Jesus, because no one makes that claim about him, nor does he. But what Paul claims is that Jesus appeared to him and gave him a revelation. And so Paul is defending his apostoleship or his apostle authority, but by justifying it by saying that the gospel that he received, he didn't receive it from those that were apostles before him, nor was he taught it by any man, but he received it as by Jesus Christ as a revelation from God. So this polemic about Paul not being a bona fide or genuine apostle of Jesus is found within the New Testament, where Paul has to defend his apostoleship. And why does he have to defend it if his apostoleship was just simply accepted by everyone? So, and even Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that I know that not everyone views me or sees me as an apostle. So even Paul was quite aware that, and by apostle, he doesn't just simply mean the non-Christians, but he actually means, Christians who also believe in Jesus, who evidently also had a gospel in their hands, but they question or undermine Paul's authority. In fact, Paul refers to them as false apostles or as false ministers, who pretend to be ministers of Christ, but in fact, the devils or Satan. So these are very harsh words that Paul uses, and you can imagine these other ministers of Christ that Paul refers to as false. If we could question them or interview them on your podcast, and we were to ask them the same question, that do you think that Paul is an apostle of Jesus? And they will say, no, Paul is a false apostle. He's the one who's preaching a different gospel. And so we should not follow him.
I guess then that one of the huge reasons why Paul was not recognized by most of the Christian church, by some, I guess, is that he was formerly someone who was an accuser of or persecutor of Christians. And so this sort of life change was very ultimately the huge reason as to why people would question him. But it's something that we could also see. Christians would see as a miracle of Christ working in his life, I guess, using someone like that. But in terms of, let's say, how you view the reliability of Paul's letters, would you also analyze it that some are unreliable and that Paul actually exaggerates a lot of things? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just because Paul was a persecutor of Christians, and so, some Christians would have been scared or frightened of him to accept him into the circle, but it was because Paul was actually teaching something different, something contrary to what these other apostles were teaching before Paul. And so Paul has to justify his own teachings by saying that he received his gospel not from any man or from anyone before him, but he received it as a direct, revelation from Jesus Christ. And also, like in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 22, verse 17 and forward, the voice that appears to Paul, identifies, himself as being Jesus. But at the same time, this voice, when Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem and meet, the Christians, the voice tells him to get away from there and to instead go to the Gentiles and to stay away from Jerusalem. And so commonly this is understood to, like how you explained, that, Christians were afraid of Paul because Paul was originally a persecutor. But couldn't the voice just had simply appeared to those other Christians or at least to the Jerusalem apostles, and say that Paul is now a true follower of mine, so there's no reason to be scared of him. But instead, you have the voice telling Paul to depart. And if this was some kind of fake Jesus or someone pretending to be Jesus, then you would expect the voice then to say something like that to Paul, to escape, because the voice didn't want himself to be exposed in front of the apostles to Paul. And also, it does appear that Paul was in the minority, at least in a church called Antioch. Because in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 and forward, you read how Paul opposed Peter to his face and accused him of acting hypocritical and contrary to the gospel. And so what was Peter's answer or response? Paul doesn't say so. He doesn't tell us. But what he does tell us, what happens next, is quite telling. He says that Barnabas was led astray by Peter's hypocrisy, and so too the church at Antioch, they were all led astray by Peter's hypocrisy. But this doesn't make sense, because if Paul was right and he won the argument, then why would Barnabas side with Peter instead of Paul? And why would the church as a whole side with Peter and not with Paul if Paul was in fact right? But instead, what you find is that Paul actually goes into a defense of his own position, and giving us his side of the story. But in terms of the authorship of Paul's letters, there's 7 letters that are regarded as being original or authentically attributed to Paul. And then there's some other letters which are doubtful. So one of these letters will be like the second letter to the Thessalonians, where actually whoever wrote Second Thessalonians seems to be quite aware that there are fraudulence being done in Paul's name. So like in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, it gives a warning to its reader to be aware that if anyone, teaches that the day of the Lord is here, then that is not a teaching from us. But the irony is that First Thessalonians does strongly indicate that the day of the Lord is here. So, for example, in First Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 4, it indicates that the day of the Lord will be something like a thief coming in at the night, and it will take people by surprise. Whereas Second Thessalonians says that the day of the Lord will not occur until these recognizable events happen, such as the appearance of the Antichrist. Whereas the first letter is saying that it will be something that will be unexpected or be surprised. Whereas the second letter is saying that it will not happen until these things happen. So applying that the day of the Lord isn't here because these things haven't yet occurred, such as the appearance of the Antichrist. And so most scholars think that, or not necessarily most scholars, but at least many scholars wouldn't think that Paul wrote Second Thessalonians. If anything, some scholars think that Second Thessalonians chapter 2 in verse 5 is indirectly saying that First Thessalonians isn't a true letter of Paul, or is like deriding First Thessalonians. Whereas, in fact, many scholars will be prepared to say that it's Second Thessalonians the one that is fraudulent.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, in this case, then
I hope that makes sense. I hope it's not too technical.
I actually
yeah.
really understand. Like, First Thessalonians, Second Thessalonians have huge contradiction in terms of theme, right, and what they're presenting. Yeah, and I want to ask you a question, because in a way, then, if this is all true, if what you're saying is that what you're presenting, the problems you're presenting, are all viable and valid, in what way do you see, for example, Christian theologians or preachers or pastors looking at the Bible and seeing a different thing, different understanding of it? How would you criticize their own methodology on it? What would be the problem in your opinion?
Yeah, this is like a real problem today, because like many of the points that I presented to you, these are like not new points, but these are points that have been known for like maybe almost 100 years or something. But the point is that this type of information generally is not shared in the pews or is not shared in the chair, but it tends to remain within academic circles. So scholars discuss amongst themselves as well as students, and it's not being transmitted or passed down onto others. And so people generally are being left in the dark as to like what is going on. But if you were to pick up like a standard introduction to the New Testament, many of these points you would find being mentioned in these introductions, especially the point about Mark being the first of the four and Matthew and Luke, copying or borrowing from Mark's gospel to write their own, as well as John being the last of the four. So this is kind of like a standard point. I mean, also New Testament scholars as well, they debate amongst themselves about many things, but this is like one of the few things in which they don't, debate nowadays, which is the Markan priority. But yeah, I'm hoping that maybe like through you and others, now more and more people will become aware, and it will spark their interest in order to, study and to research more. And also, I'm open, like I'm accessible. If people want to reach me, if you just type my name into Facebook, you can find me. Normally, Facebook Messenger is the best way to get in touch with me. But I'm in most social platforms like Skype and Twitter.
Okay, awesome. And it's almost an hour now, and it's been great talking to you. Nazam.
Wow.
And
No, it's been amazing. Yeah, thank you.
One last question to end this all, and you seem to be a genuine guy, and you know that you have the truth in Islam and the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, and you want to present to other people, especially the Christian community, who seem to be in a way not even aware of these problems. At least if you are genuine with your faith, and you know that you believe in Jesus Christ, then you know also these parts of your beliefs, that could be shaky in a way, and shaky in the foundations. And so, what would you tell to a Christian or someone, maybe an atheist, or someone who would be listening right now and checking out and discovering the truth for themselves?
I would say keep an open mind. Continue to study and research, and keep good company, and and sincerely, ask God, the Creator, for guidance and for help, and just try to be the best human being that you can, and try to make a difference, like in the world, like how you are doing as well. And we don't need to change the world all in one night, but we can start with small things and start with those people that are closest to us.
Well, Nazam, thank you so much for your time, brother.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine.
Okay, so that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
If you're a movie collector, you need Movies Anywhere. It pulls your favorite purchase movies from participating digital retailers into one central place, so you can finally say goodbye to scattered movie collections and hello to an organized library. With Movies Anywhere, you can watch your favorite movies on any compatible device whenever and wherever you want. Ready to grow and enjoy your digital collection? Visit moviesanywhere.com/welcome and register for free. Registration with Movies Anywhere required. Open to U.S. residents 13 and over.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.